terror against Tesla. The party of defending democracy is firebombing an electric car company's dealerships because they disagree with the political views of its owner. That and Joe Biden wants back in. All that and more today on 10-Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Yesterday morning, there were reports out of CNBC and others of incendiary devices at a Tesla dealership in Austin. This follows several weeks of insane events, protests that have become violent outside of Tesla dealerships, viral videos of left-wing protesters trying to force Tesla owners off the road to yell at them about their choice in vehicles. The party of democracy has shifted quite drastically to where they are now trying to destroy this electric car company. And I think it's been really crazy and troubling to watch, but a lot of it is tied to the cheerleading of Democrats like Tim Walz.
Saying on my phone, I don't know, some of you know this on the iPhone, they've got that little stock app. I added Tesla to it to give me a little boost during the day. 225 and dropping.
I think it's important to note there that while Tim cheers for any kind of downturn in Tesla stock, his state has hundreds of millions of dollars of pension funds invested in Tesla. So, of course, about a day or two later, he had to come back out and apologize.
Said something I didn't, probably shouldn't have about a company.
You'll remember from the campaign when Tim made several misstatements and tried to excuse them as a knucklehead. In this case, it is everyone else's fault that he accidentally cheered for the demise of his own pensioners' funds in his state. But I think that this also really speaks to an interesting dynamic of the state of the climate change debate. You'll remember that President Biden focused nearly every dime of his political capital on trying to get more people to buy electric cars, whether it was through tax credits that predominantly went to wealthy people, or just a number of deals that made it more enticing for people to invest in green technology. Only a few months out of office, we have the former vice presidential candidate for Democrats attacking one of the most successful electric vehicle companies in our nation's history. But we also have things like Mark Kelly.
Elon Musk kind of turned out to be an and I don't want to be driving a car built and designed by
Now, I will note Mark Kelly just spent 4 years voting for those same tax credits to try and get more and more people into electric cars at the expense of gas-powered cars like the Chevy Tahoe that he's moving into. He also supported the Democrat presidential candidate who called for banning gas-powered vehicles. So I think it's really interesting to look at this and ask, were Democrats really focused on the changing climate, on lowering emissions, or was it just about power? What we've seen in the months since Joe Biden left office is so many of these giant funding programs were less about changing global temperatures and much more about creating slush funds to allow Democrats more political power and to give their nonprofit groups like Stacey Abrams, who received a $2 billion grant dealing with climate change, more power to then go out, register Democrats, and do their political activities. As we talked about last episode, following the money is so important here. Last week, President Trump announced an executive order to begin the process of shutting down the Department of Education. That is something he campaigned on, that is something that he ran on, and it's something that Republicans have been talking about really for decades. But that has been met with a flurry of lies and misinformation about what that's going to mean for the state of education in America. A cousin reached out to me who's preparing to become a teacher and said, what does this mean? It doesn't mean a whole lot, in large part because most of education is both funded and overseen at the state level. That was always the intention when the founders set up our country. It was also the plan when the Department of Education was set up, that it would supplement and provide support, not play the controlling role that it's taken on. Now, when you look at the state of education in our country right now, only 24% of people have a positive view of the state of public education. A plurality of people disapprove of the role that the Department of Education is playing. Why? Probably because it has such a terrible return on investment. This is something that President Trump talked about. As we spend more and more money on education through our Department of Education, a $250 billion department, we're actually seeing test scores continue to drop. 60% of kids in America cannot read at grade level. And that's a huge problem. So as you see both teachers union officials and Democrats come out and say President Trump is going to ruin education, you have to look at and consider the fact that education is already terrible and it's a disaster. So let's go through a couple of these one by one. First, that we're not going to have funding for states for education. Let's look at that clip.
The reality that they will not have arts and music, the reality that they will not have after-school programs. And we understand that the ultimate goal here is to take money away from our kids, to steal money from them.
The reality is there will still be funds for states to receive in block grants from the federal government. The problem right now with the Department of Education is as our tax dollars go to Washington and it's sent back to states, it's basically like a conveyor belt for bureaucrats along the way to take little bits and pieces out of it, for teachers unions to take little bits and pieces out of it. So our money that's intended to help our kids learn how to read and write better is picked out along the way. And so when you fix this program so that block grants are given to the states without conditions, they might actually have more money. And when you look at what some of these conditions are, particularly the last 4 years under President Biden, it was things like you can only receive this federal grant money if you also adopt this incredibly divisive program, whether it was things like critical race theory or diversity, equity, inclusion, and things like that. That was one of the levers that the Biden administration had used to push their political agenda. Another myth that we heard is that there won't be any support now for students with disabilities. New Education Secretary Linda McMahon went on TV yesterday to correct the record on that important point.
The outward-facing programs that are going to be affecting students are, there's not going to be any defunding for those programs.
One of the common defenses we've seen from the left of any program that Doge, President Trump, and Elon have tried to fix is we're going to lose this really important point. But when you look at things like Care for Students with Disabilities or the Pell Grant program, which will be continued likely through Treasury, those are very narrow parts of this much larger department. They are saying we can't do this narrow function without saving this $250 billion bureaucracy. That's nonsense. And that thinking is how we got into this mess to begin with. And it should make you really, really mad that your tax dollars that are meant to help your kid learn to read and write are getting picked apart along the way and given out to all these really outrageous special interests. Another really key point there came from Tim Walz.
And he's surrounded by people who know nothing about education, and they want to make this about bureaucracy and cutting. This is about children.
Now, when Tim says they want to make this about bureaucracy and cutting, it's about the children, the bureaucracy is the problem. The bureaucracy is what's keeping the money from getting to the children. As we talked about before, right now money flows from Washington and is picked apart by teachers unions, by bureaucrats, and by these conditional programs that move it to political agendas further and further away from our kids. And that should make you absolutely furious. Take a look at Tim Walz's record. There's a reason that he is the favorite of these grifting teachers unions who have destroyed education. One, it's because he's against school choice. And two, it's because he has constantly supported putting more money into education without conditioning it to any kind of student success. But look at his record. Education in Minnesota is 38th in return on investment, 45th in education choice, 30-year low in test scores, and a majority of Minnesota students are failing their math and reading benchmarks. So again, no wonder the teachers unions love Tim Walz, but we deserve better. There was an Axios story in the Monday morning newsletter about how Democrats have destroyed their brand. What it showed that everyone but dyed-in-the-wool liberals are moving away from the Democrat Party. More and more people are identifying either with conservatism or just, not identifying with Democrats. And I believe that there are 4 key reasons for that. First, spending priorities that primarily focus on helping wealthy Democrats. Things like student loan bailout, things like tax credits for electric vehicles. The second thing that I think really had an impact here was the immigration agenda. They opened the border intentionally. They announced they were doing it, and it created chaos. Number 3, cancel culture. There was a long period of time where anyone who mentioned anything that didn't feel completely politically correct was getting canceled. This isn't just Republicans complaining about it. People like Charlemagne the God and other high-profile Democrats and liberals have said toxic cancel culture really hurt their brand. The fourth thing that I think really had an impact on the youngest generation is COVID lockdowns and what the pandemic did to students who are now voters for the first time who are saying, wait a sec, in a moment of crisis, they shut down schools. Teachers unions asked for more money for schools, they shut it down. And I think that has had a lot to do with the youngest generation of voters getting more and more and more conservative. Now, take all those 4, things and everything else that's really hurt the Democrat brand and consider a new NBC report over the weekend showed Joe Biden wants back in. He's looking around, he's surveying the field, and he's saying, wait a sec, there's no leader. Maybe it's my time. And I've said it reminds me a little bit of Grandpa Joe from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when he gets wheeled out to take Charlie in, you know, and Joe's only been out of the limelight for 3 or 4 months, but he's been basically shut down in a closet for 3 years with the auto pen and staff kind of operating him. So it is hilarious that the guy who drove them to these depths is now talking about wanting his way back in. When you look around at Democrats, every single one of them is waking up in the morning, looking in the mirror and seeing the future savior of the party. None of them are looking in that mirror and saying, it's me, I'm the problem, it's me, I caused this. And people like Joe Biden and Tim Walz, who might think it's their moment in the sun to come back, probably should reconsider. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us for 10 Minute Drill. Please subscribe on YouTube, follow us on all your favorite podcast platforms, tell your friends. Thanks again for joining us.